Recently, I was asked if it was possible to create the appearance of a twisted steel cable inside of Keyshot. Now, I first began creating a 3D model of the steel cable. Needless to say, this was both difficult and time-consuming. Then I tried using image-based textures, which I'll admit turned out pretty well, but sometimes it's hard to track down the exact textures you need. Then I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could get similar results using only Keyshot's material graph? Let's find out. Okay, so our first step is to import our 3D model, and I'll make this model free for you to download from my file vault. Once we bring it into Keyshot, we want to take the default import settings. The tessellation quality should be set to 0.2, and we want import NURBS data to be turned on. This is important because we're going to be UV unwrapping the cable, and without those settings matching mine, you could run into some different issues on your end. After our model imports, you might notice it doesn't look like we need to do any texturing. That's because I went ahead and 3D modeled this cable. The goal of this tutorial is to show you 3 different ways to get a steel cable rendered out of Keyshot. And the first and probably most obvious is to just use a 3D model of a steel cable. But if you've ever tried to model a steel cable in a CAD program, like I did here with Fusion 360, you'll know how painful this process is. It's not that easy. And if I zoom in, you might notice it does not look very smooth or good. That has to do with our tessellation quality. Keyshot runs faster if we have fewer triangles in our scene, but in order for things like this to look smooth, you have to have a very high tessellation. One cool way around this is to use NURBS. NURBS is basically the CAD data that we work on in a program like Fusion 360 or SolidWorks or something like that. Now I can go to my toolbar and enable NURBS and watch how smooth the surfaces on this cable look. That's because it's bypassing tessellation and using the actual CAD data called NURBS. Now, why wouldn't we always do this? Well, it's just not as efficient. If you look at the heads-up display, I've got about 100 frames per second with NURBS on. If I turn NURBS off, 350. So you can see there's a big performance hit taken when you render NURBS. Option number 1 is to basically use a 3D model of a steel cable. So option number 2 and 3 are going to rely on textures. Number 2 will be image-based textures, and number 3 I'm going to show you is how to do this all procedurally in Keyshot. So what I want to do is actually just duplicate this entire group here, and that way I have 2 of these. I'll go ahead and turn off the first one, and then in my second one, I'm going to hide the modeled cable, and you can see this yellow cable in the middle. This is the one that I'm going to work on for my textures. To hide everything except for this, I'll just hold Alt and left click. So typically right now I would go and do a UV unwrap, but I want to show you something here. Inside here you can see how tightly packed the triangles are on this tube. It's going to be really hard to choose a good seam with triangles like this. Generally what you want are some straight lines to pick and ones that will not zigzag as they move across the surface. So I'm going to try to fix that by doing a retessellate. So I right click on the tube and go to retessellate, and this should help. Now if I just take the default settings, do tessellate, what you'll notice is it looks fairly similar, but we should be able to get some slightly better surfaces. I'm going to take my tessellation quality up to 0.2 or maybe 0.3. And what I'm looking for is some more evenly spaced triangles. If I take the maximum edge length down a little bit, let's try taking tessellation quality down so we don't have quite as many of them. And then I'm going to take my max edge length down. So maybe try 3, maybe even 2. It's getting closer. I think 3 looked good. I'm going to go back to 3. I'm trying to get as close as I can to some straight lines. This is just going to make it easier to create a better seam for UV unwrapping here. So I want to go ahead and apply this, and I'll go ahead and hit done. So the next thing I want to do is split the bottom or the ends of this tube off. So I'm going to right click and just do a split object surfaces. Order of operations actually matter here. If I were to try to do this before doing the retessellate, I'm pretty sure it won't work. I think retessellate has to happen first, unfortunately. So from here, we're going to right click on the tube again, the middle piece, and we're going to go back into UV unwrap, and we should now hopefully be able to successfully unwrap this object, which will help us texture it properly. And you can see we're missing the bottom flat surfaces from this tube. So if I zoom in here, all I need to do is add one seam that runs across this tube. So I'm trying to line my camera up with the grid on the ground. You can kind of see a straight line. I'm going to choose Add Seam. Click once to turn that blue knot to red. And then if I go up one space and click again, you'll see that we have a dashed line. If I turn my camera around facing the other way, you can see that dashed line goes all the way to the bottom here. So I'm going to click on that next, and now we've gone ahead and created a seam that runs across this entire thing. We also want to use this as a direction guide. I'll hit the green checkbox to apply that seam. The direction guide tells KeyShot that when we unwrap it to align the UV grid or texture to this line, and then we click on this once to flood fill and then do unwrap. And if I bring the scale of this UV grid up a little bit, what we're looking for is a UV grid that's not distorted in any way. While KeyShot's UV unwrap tools are pretty basic, this looks like it performed a clean unwrap for me, or at least as close as I can wish for. So go ahead and hit apply, and hopefully this works. The KeyShot Material Masterclass is the biggest, most comprehensive course dedicated to material creation in KeyShot ever. With feature-based and project-based lessons, I cover a wide range of topics like PBR workflow, texture gamma and bit depth, UV unwrapping, and how to master the material graph. I'll guide you through creating a modern bathroom scene complete with dynamic lighting and material imperfections down to the dust particles and fingerprints. With 166 lessons, this is my most epic masterclass course yet. I can't wait to see what you make after taking the course. Link in the description below. All right, so now that we've UV unwrapped this, let's go ahead and take a look at the texture we're going to use. This is for approach number 2. We're going to use image-based textures. These textures on this website called TextureCan are free, and it looks like somebody used Substance Designer, I believe, to create this procedural steel cable material. So this is what we're going to use for approach number 2. And then for number 3, we're going to do it completely in the material graph, which is cool. So we're going to double click on this, go into the material graph. All right, and I'll go ahead and hit C on the keyboard to put a white background up behind my cable here. I'm gonna grab these textures that came from that website I just mentioned. I'll drag them into the material graph here, and let's take a look at what we have. We have a color texture, we have an ambient occlusion texture, we have a roughness, 2 normal maps, a metallic, and we have a height map. Whenever you get a metallic map, that tells me that these were created to be used with KeyShot's generic material. So I'm going to go to my diffuse node up here and change it from diffuse to generic. This is kind of like the standard principled shader you can find in a lot of other render engines. It's built off Disney's BRDF material, I believe. And so we can take this metallic and plug it right on in. Now the main thing I want to do is get the texture mapping handled before connecting all these nodes. And I want to start off with the actual color map first. I'm going to go ahead and right click and get a utility called Mapping 2D. Anytime we're managing a bunch of other textures like this, it's good to use a Mapping 2D node to control the texture mapping of all of these others. So we're going to connect the Mapping 2D to our color node. We'll plug this into our base color for our generic material. And then in texture map, this one that we just connected, we're going to change it from box to node-based mapping. And then under mapping 2D, we want to change it to UV, which should tell this to use the UVs that we have here on our cable. Now I am seeing a bit of a misalignment here, which is not ideal, but we may need to make some adjustments to it. I'll go ahead and scale this guy down a little bit. Okay, so that's too small. I'm going to go about 0.5 and see what that looks like. 0.4, 0.5. All right, so I kind of went by eye, but I basically set this to 0.475 in order to get this to seamlessly line up here. What I was looking for is how the texture here, there's a little bit of a seam there. In this case, I think this looks a little small. So I'm gonna increase the scale of this a little bit. And I'm gonna try to, let's see, that's looking pretty good. Let's go a little bit bigger. Is that lined up? 0.71. All right, I think that's looking pretty good to me for now. So I'm gonna just go with this size. Again, we're controlling this with the mapping 2D, and it's important to get this set up right because every other texture that we plug this into will then match and be the correct scale and mapping. So what else do we need? This is a generic material and this is a metallic part or object. So I'm gonna plug this mapping 2D into our metallic map and plug this into metallic. And now we notice it gets shiny. The next thing I wanna do is find our displacement, and let's see what we have. We have a height map, which is interesting. We don't have anything that's called displace, but we're gonna use height map for displacement. That should work. I'm gonna plug that in there. Let's go ahead and get a right click, go to geometry displace, and plug the texture map into there, and plug this into our geometry socket on our root node. If we go into displace, let's be careful about how high we're displacing it. Let's try something like 2 millimeters maybe. I'm gonna go ahead and just give this a shot and see what happens. So it didn't look like it did a whole lot of good for us. Let's go ahead and see what's going on. I think it has to do with the color here. I'm gonna disable the other two nodes that we have. I'm gonna put a color to number in between this height map and the displace and preview it with C. So we got a lot of gray. What we should have are black and white values here. Not entirely sure why this height map is the way it is. It's just not what KeyShot's used to. So I'm gonna play with these values and see if I can fix it. So I'm gonna take the output 2, which controls the white point, and I'll try something like 5. So that goes pretty dang bright. Let's try something like 2. So it makes the whole thing brighter. Let me take the input from and increase that. See if we can darken some of the areas. That's looking good. Now, obviously the mapping is not correct. So let's make sure that we have the mapping set right. So I'll double click this texture map and change it from box to node. And now it should take its marching orders from this mapping 2D. And then back into our color to number, I want to increase the output 2 to make that gray area brighter. We're looking for white and black values. So let's try 5 again, 10. So basically what I'm looking to do is get this map into a black and white status. The white is going to be pushed out by the displaced node, whereas the black will not be. So I want to be as close as I can. Let's see, I don't think I want the black to be quite as dark as it is there. I think something like that looks pretty good. Let's give this a shot. So if I get out of that preview now and we try to refresh the geometry node, haha, look at that displacement. That's looking much closer to what we need. The triangles are looking pretty bad here, but we can fix that by increasing our displace triangle size. We actually want to make this smaller. So I'll bring this down to 0.1, which is pretty small, but should help. And there we're getting, I think, enough detail for us to say that's a success, as far as I'm aware. So that's looking pretty good. Wow, that's kind of interesting. Let's actually do that. Let's go ahead into the bottom here, which I think has the same material applied. Let's see. I'll just turn that off for now. Okay, so back in our material graph, we have our displacement. Let's go ahead and enable that metallic. That looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and enable that color map, which looks pretty decent as well. All right, let's make use of one of these normal maps. I'm gonna grab this one that says OpenGL. I'm gonna plug it into my mapping 2D. Double click on the normal map, make sure it's set to node-based mapping, and I'll plug it into the bump socket on the generic material. I'm not liking the look of these black lines that show up, so something's not going well. I'm gonna go down to my bump height and invert it and change it from 1 to -1 and see if that helps. And notice how it looks correct now and it added some more detail to the surface. So that's good, but it's a little strong. So I'm gonna take this normal map height instead of -1. I'm gonna try -0.1, maybe a little higher, -0.25. I think that's looking pretty good. Now, one of the last things we want to do here is get our roughness texture involved. I don't need this other normal map, so I'll delete it. And I'll take this roughness map and plug it into the mapping 2D. Make sure the roughness map is set to node. We're going to plug this roughness into our generic material. And overall, I think it looks pretty decent. It's kind of, I don't know, it doesn't have the contrast between shiny and rough the way I would normally like it to. So I'm going to go ahead and use a color to number just to make a quick change to that. So when I preview this, the whiter areas are going to be more rough and the darker areas are going to be more shiny. So I'm going to increase the shininess by taking those dark areas and making them a little darker. The way we do this is take the input from and start to increase it, and that'll darken them. And I want to leave those white areas pretty bright so they can be, you know, nice and matte. So let's just see how that looks if I get out of that preview. We should have a fairly shiny steel cable that's less shiny in the crevices, and that's looking pretty good. I think I'm going to call this good for now. I know it came with an ambient occlusion texture. I don't think we really need that, so I'm just going to delete it. And right there, we have basically a PBR texture where we grab these textures from a website, we use them in the material graph, and adapted them as we needed to create something that looks reasonably good in KeyShot. It certainly beats 3D modeling the cable, which for me took well over an hour, just given how Fusion 360 was responding to it, versus this just took a few minutes. So this is one approach. So when comparing the 3D modeled cable with the one we just made using image-based textures, we can see that the one with image-based textures still has a bit of a visible seam in here, which is a little unfortunate. That's not so ideal. We also see that it's a little on the big side. I could probably try scaling that down a bit. I'm not sure how well that would work. Let me just try disabling that displace. If I go into my mapping 2D, preview the color map, and go into mapping 2D and see what happens if I scale this down a little bit. So maybe something like this will look a little bit better. Let me go ahead and refresh that geometry node and see how that looks. Enable that displace, give that a shot. So there we go. Now we're getting quite a bit closer to the appearance of the 3D modeled version. It looks like my displacement's a little high here, so I'm gonna go to like 1.5 maybe. Let's give that a shot. I could spend more time finessing this, but the whole goal here is to show you how to do this 3 different ways, and I really want to show you how this is done procedurally in KeyShot, because in my opinion, that offers the most control, and it's pretty simple. So let's go ahead and give that one a shot. Now to save us a little bit of time, I want to duplicate this second model, the one where we use the texture here. So I'm just going to right click and go down to duplicate, and I'm going to move this one on over, and this is going to be the one that we're going to do procedurally using just the material graph. So let's go ahead and hide the 3D modeled version, and I'll probably refer back to the other version in a little bit, but for now we're just going to focus on the cable here. So I want to turn off the block and bolts, and we're just going to get into this material graph here. Before making changes, I want to right click on this and go to unlink material. We're going to go into the material graph. We're going to start off by just shift selecting a box and deleting everything in here. I'll leave the displacement and the generic shader. We're going to change to just a metal, and we'll go ahead and refresh the geometry node. So let's go ahead and just start by changing this into a color that is more metallic, more gray. Then what I want to do is use a couple of mesh procedurals. So I'll right click, go to textures, mesh. We're going to plug this into the color, and in this case we're going to change this mesh to be UV mapped. And then we want to change from a shape of circles to lines, and then we're going to change the angle of this. So we'll go ahead and change the angle UV to something like 20. Let me reference the one that we made earlier so I get this in the correct direction. So you'll notice we want them twisting around to the left. I'm going to get back into my material graph. Okay, let's try negative 20. 30 minus 45. That looks pretty close. So I want to make these bigger. These are going to be the big bumps that you see. To shape them, we need to, first of all, scale them up, but then we also need to create this soft fall off. So we can go to the fall off and we start to increase it, and it blurs the edge of those black lines. So it's easier to see if we preview it. So I'll hit C to preview this node, and I'll bring the fall off up to something like 0.9. And what we want to do is basically have the black part represent the low areas, and we want the white parts to represent the high areas. But the problem with that is that it just doesn't appear that we're getting that gradient. So we need to probably play with our pattern spacing a little bit, but we'll come back to that if we need to. Let's just start off with this basic shape and see what it looks like. I'm going to plug this into displace for now. Go ahead and refresh this or execute this geometry node and see what happens. So inside our mesh here, we're going to preview it. I want to actually take the background color in the background and switch them. I'm going to make the color white and the background black. If we get out of our preview, let's go ahead and just execute that node. So now we're getting something that looks a little bit better, where we're getting these nice bumps, but what we're not getting is the spacing. There's too far spaced out. So we're going to take the pattern spacing and we're going to reduce that. So we'll go back into my preview and I will disable the displacement for now. And if we take our spacing down between this pattern, we should start to get these white areas closer together. We also need to make them bigger. So I think that's looking a little bit closer. Let's go ahead and give that a shot again. So I'm going to refresh and see if that looks closer. So that's looking pretty good. We can probably play a little bit with that fall off. Definitely want to go higher, 0.99. That's just going to make them look more rounded and pillowed. And then we may need to make the spacing a little bit smaller yet. There we go. Now we're starting to look pretty close. Now we're also displacing this quite a bit. We may need to back that down just a little bit. So for our displace, I'll try something like 1.25. Give that a shot. And that's looking pretty good so far. This is definitely workable. Let's move on to the next part, which is getting all the detail of the smaller parts. And one thing we need to pay attention to that I kind of, we can't see from this angle is how our texture map is aligning. You see how it's not lined up here? This is going to be something that we need to play around a little bit with our angle UV to get it to look right. This is one of the kind of tricky parts here. It's a little bit similar to how we were playing with the size of the other texture map to get it to look correct. So after bringing that to about 55, this ended up looking pretty good to my eyes. Now the next thing I want to do is get another mesh. So I'm just going to hold Alt and drag to duplicate this mesh. And we're going to use it to create these smaller details. So in this case, I'm going to preview this mesh, which looks the same as the other one. So I'm going to preview this mesh, and what I want to do is make it quite a bit smaller, and we're going to play with the angle as well. So first thing I'm going to do is scale it down, and then I'm going to play with the angle UV and make it a little bit more vertical. Maybe I'll do -20 or so, and we'll make this even smaller. Let's go ahead and see how that looks. So to combine these two, I want to use a node called Color Composite. So I'll right click on that connector, do a Color Composite, plug the new one into the background, give it a preview with C, and then we're going to go down to Multiply for our blend mode. And this basically does, or should do, what I want. Let's go ahead and just give it a shot as is. Okay, so this isn't exactly looking what we want it to look like. So I'm going to get into this mesh, and I believe it has to do with these white and black values. Our displace node is pushing these white and black values as far on the smaller texture as it is on the big texture. So let's take the black background color. We're going to lift this to somewhere around 50%. And let's just see if that starts to resolve this pinching effect that we're getting here. So that looks like it's a little bit better because each of these small strands don't need to be pushed in as far as these big parts of the cable. So that's pretty good. What I want to do is get into this mesh and probably bring the pattern spacing down to get these a little closer together. So instead of 0.005, let's try 0.002. That should squish those together a little bit. Let me see how that looks. So that's looking pretty good. That definitely gives us a little more detail. Maybe they're a little smaller than I want them to be at that point. So I can bring the spacing up to 0.0025 and maybe just overall increase the size of it just a bit. And then I'm going to take that background, gray color and make it just a little bit darker. And do that until I can kind of finesse the way these smaller cables look. I also want to take that displace once I'm happy with that and maybe even make the triangle size a bit smaller, 0.05 millimeters. Let's give that a shot. Let me try 10 million max triangles, give that a shot. Cool. So I'm going to take this mesh background, I'm going to darken this gray even further, and I'm going to make it just a touch bigger, this texture. Still looking a little small. Let's give that a shot. Very cool. We still have a bit of a visual seam here, which is kind of problematic. Let me see if we can adjust this at all by playing with our angle UV, 21.5. Let's give that a shot. So that closes that seam up a little bit there. Looking pretty good there. To really bring this across the finish line, we need to pull some detail from here. We use this color composite to then control a few more settings on our metal. For example, we can control the color of it a little bit better, so we get some of those dark areas. So if we plug this into our color, you can see what it looks like. I'm going to use a color to number right in here. We'll preview this. And I want to make the areas between each of these small cables a little bit darker. So what we can do is take that input from, which is that black, start to increase that. And you may notice it's just targeting those really dark areas. So we're going to do this a slightly different way. We're going to use another color composite, and we're going to plug the small or second set of lines into the background, and then we'll just use the We'll use the normal one as the source. And what we can do here is we're just going to set this to multiply, and that's going to darken those small mesh stripes. And what we can do is take the blend and take the source alpha and make that not quite as dark. So now the whole thing has matching gray values, more or less. And then we can use our color to number that we put in here to really punch those up. So we'll take that input from, start to increase that to darken those values. And we can just play with these two as we need to. There we go. So that will help us with our color of our metal, and we can also take the output 2 and make it more of a gray instead of a white. And this will create the overall color for our metal. It's looking pretty good. Maybe it's still a little bit bright. Now we also need to play with the roughness because we're getting a lot of character from the roughness. So we can use this same thing that we just created, this color to number, to control our roughness. And now that we did that, we'll take this color composite, the second one that we did, plug it into roughness for our metal, create a new color to number, preview it. And what I want to do is use these values to control the roughness. Right now, they're way too bright. So we're going to darken them like we did before. The black areas for roughness are going to make the material more shiny, and the white areas will appear more rough. So what we're essentially going to need to do is invert this. And we can do that by taking the output from and swapping it with the output to. So we invert those, and now where it's black, it's going to be the shiniest, and where it's white, it's going to be the most rough. So we want to basically bring this down a little bit. And we're hoping to take where it's black, shouldn't be too perfectly shiny, so we should have just a little bit of roughness there. And where it's white, we shouldn't be too rough either, so we'll bring that down with the output from. So as we're looking at this, now we should have this kind of variable roughness going on, which should pretty closely match the other one. It's not perfect, but it's pretty close. In my opinion, it looks like we got pretty close to matching the texture-based version. Maybe what we need to do is take our second mesh and just make it a little bit bigger. And let's refresh that, see how that looks. That's looking better. And then maybe just again with the darkness of the color, maybe we can darken that a little bit too by taking our input from up, something like that. And then maybe this color composite, this goes down and this goes back up. That's looking pretty close. I think at this point we're gonna call it good. This is what we get. This is like a simpler node tree in my opinion. It's fully procedural, and I think it looks like we were able to deal with that seam a little better than we were with the image-based texture. All right, there you have it. 3 different approaches to steel cable: modeled, image-based textures, and Keyshot's material graph. So after getting to this point, I took a break and came back with fresh eyes. I made some small tweaks to the cable material, added some texture detail, dialed in the composition and highlights a bit, and this is what I ended up with. I'm pretty happy with the results. I hope you learned a lot here, and until next time, happy rendering.